Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group, and the topic for today's webinar is Local Strategies for Data Center Reform. And we have an excellent panel of guest speakers with us today, but before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a couple of webinar logistics. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your webcam and microphone are disabled, as well as the chat function. So if you would like to submit questions and comments, you can do so via the Q&A panel. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the end of the presentations to address all of the Q&A questions. So please type your question into the chat and into the Q&A panel as you think of it, and then we'll address those questions at the end. Automated captions are available. Speaker bios will also be made available in the chat as the speakers are being introduced. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a webinar recording in 24 to 48 hours, and it will also be posted on CEG's website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today, my colleague, Ava Morgan.
Thanks, Serene, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As Serene mentioned, this webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group. For those of you not familiar with Clean Energy Group, we are a national nonprofit headquartered in Vermont, working to accelerate affordable, reliable, and clean energy for all. Please check out our website for more information on our initiatives. That's cleanegroup.org. Next slide. This webinar is being conducted under our Phase Out Peakers project initiative. So for the past several years, we've been working with community-based organizations to replace peaker power plants in environmental justice communities with clean alternatives. Next slide, please. So as Serene mentioned, today's webinar is called Local Strategies for Data Center Reform, and we have a wonderful panel of speakers today. Katie Miner is the Community Solutions Manager for the Alliance for Affordable Energy based in Louisiana. Julie Bolthouse is the Director of Land Use for Piedmont Environmental Council in Virginia. Matt Shorraw is the Policy and Program Coordinator for Physicians for Social Responsibility in Pennsylvania. My name is Ava Morgan, and I'm a project manager here at Clean Energy Group. So just a reminder, if questions pop up, stick them in the Q&A chat at the bottom, and we will get to questions at the end of the presentations. We'll get started with a quick overview on data centers so we can all start from the same place. Next slide, please. What are data centers? So these are facilities that hold servers and other computing hardware. They're used for cloud computing, so that is streaming, email, search engine, basically anything that uses information or data on the internet that is not stored directly on your computer. So on these data center campuses, there are also cooling systems. These servers get quite hot when they are working, and so they need cooling systems to cool them down to an optimal temperature, and then also backup generators in case of an outage to power these data centers. The centers are owned either directly by companies that use them, like big tech companies like Microsoft and Meta, or they're owned by third-party companies that lease out the computing power within the data center. Next slide, please. These data centers, as you can see by this map created by Frac Tracker Alliance, these data centers are being proposed and built sort of all across the United States, but there's a special concentration of them on the East Coast. Next slide. And so, why are there so many new data center proposals? This has really been caused by a rise in artificial intelligence use and generative AI. When you open an app, when you go to Google, AI overviews, AI assistants, they're sort of popping up all over the place and becoming more and more ubiquitous. These sort of programs, they take a lot of computing power. And so a lot more data centers are being built to supply that demand for the computing power for AI across, all different types of use. There's also a ton of investment from private equity. They're investing billions of dollars into these data centers. They're seeing it as sort of an economic growth opportunity. Whether or not there will be demand for these data centers, the investments are still there from private equity. There are also federal and state incentives to win the AI race, both globally and, the race in between states. Federally, there's been, regulations lifted and a promise to make federal lands more accessible to build data centers. And then on a state level, most states have tax exemptions for data center developers, whether that be sales tax or property taxes, to, bring data centers to their states. Next slide, please. I'm just going to go over, briefly some of the key concerns. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but energy use and load growth is one of the main concerns when it comes to this increase in data center development. Hyperscale data centers, which are the massive ones being built today, they can consume very large amounts of electricity. So they require hundreds to thousands of megawatts, and that's enough electricity to power cities sometimes. This electricity is used to power the servers mainly, but also cooling systems and then other electricity demands throughout the campuses. Data centers, can build their own electricity, their own power plants, but typically we're seeing that they're wanting to connect to the grid and draw those large amounts of electricity from the grid and interconnect to utilities. And so, a key concern with this is that data centers are typically not a flexible load. So that means when peak demand is high, when there is a lot of strain on the grid, data centers don't come offline. They still require that amount of energy, and they can't sort of lower their energy use based, or they don't lower their energy use based on, the grid. Next. So what we're already seeing and what we'll likely see more of in the future is that this increase in load growth from data center proposals and build out it'll be new fossil fuel power plants. And then also power plants that were slated to retire, that retirement is being delayed. And so because of both of these things, there will be higher electricity bills. And, as we'll go over later in this webinar, that's already happening. The cost for new power plants for these data centers is not, only paid for by data centers. The cost is socialized among utility ratepayers. And so, local residents will see their electricity bills rise because of data center proposals and build out. Next slide, please. Another key concern is water use. Most data centers use water to cool their servers. About 80% of that water is evaporated. And then, a recent analysis found that 2/3 of new data centers built or proposed since 2022 are planned for water-stressed regions. And so that is a major concern. And with that, I will pass it on to KD.
Hey everyone, and I'm wondering if my audio is good as we transition to my slides.
Yep, you sound good.
Awesome, thank you. Again, thanks everyone for taking the time to learn about the data center fight here in Louisiana. I am Katie Miner. I'm the Community Solutions Manager for the Alliance for Affordable Energy. For over 40 years, we've worked through the regulatory process at the Louisiana Public Service Commission and at the New Orleans City Council to ensure adequate, safe, and efficient protections for ratepayers. Most recently, our work has evolved to include carbon capture, where we sued the EPA to maintain authority over underground injections. I also worked to slow the build out of other fossil solutions like ammonia and hydrogen, LNG, and now data centers. Next slide, please. So this is going to be very interesting because as recently as yesterday, there have been a ton of updates to the scope of this project. And so I'm just going to share what I know to be true, pending nothing else changes between now and then. So back in December 2024, Meta publicly announced a plan to build a massive data center in rural Richland Parish in North Louisiana, about 30 miles from the closest urban city. Now, we learned that this area, like many around the country, was really attractive because of their ease of access to both the administration and to resources. Then on July 14th, one day before Entergy, which is our utilities evidentiary hearing, before it began at the Public Service Commission, Meta's CEO announced on Threads, of all places, the plan to scale the data center, which he called Hyperion, up to over 5 gigawatts, up from the 2.5 that had been reported publicly. The current scope of the project is as large as the footprint of Manhattan and demands as much as 2 times the electricity we use here in New Orleans at the peak of summer. If you've ever been to New Orleans, think of how hot it is and how much power we have to use to keep the city cool. And to be clear, Hyperion very literally means the God above. This campus would house 11 buildings at over 4 million square feet, costing over $27 billion. This is the number we just got, 27 billion, up from 10 billion, nearly triple the amount announced back in November 2024. Next slide, please. Just how big is this planned data center? We counted 173 superdomes. Couldn't find a cool way to feature that, so we made this graphic where you literally see just how many superdomes you would have to walk to be able to cover the size of this campus. Next slide, please. Now, to power this new data center, Entergy Louisiana, which is an investor-owned utility, applied for permission from the Louisiana Public Service Commission to build 3 new natural gas power plants at the cost of $3.2 billion. Now, typically, when a utility needs to produce more electricity to meet a demand, they're legally required to conduct an RFP, or a request for proposal. Now, the sole purpose of this RFP is to require utilities to look at the market and see what's the best cost resource to serve all customers. Now, for this project, Entergy Louisiana did not follow the RFP policy. And as you can see from this slide, that nearly 73% of our power generation already comes from gas. And as the country's highest emitter, 3 new natural gas plants to serve 1 hyperscaler is a 25% increase in Entergy Louisiana's power generation. Next slide, please. Tech companies like Meta are advancing artificial intelligence technologies and looking for places, again, with cheap power and limited utility regulations to locate their centers. From the inception of this Richland Parish data center proposal at Washington Mardi Gras, it was clear state and local officials were willing to do whatever it took to get the Meta project through regulatory hurdles as quickly and as seamlessly as possible, even if it meant bending the rules and creating special tax incentives, regulatory benefits, and other things to get us there. Entergy repeatedly corrupted the avenues for proper commission and public consideration, including shrouding details in secrecy. And in less than 10 months, the Public Service Commission, the 5-member elected body in charge of considering the application, voted to approve the new electricity infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now, this is truly an unprecedented process here. In the first meeting with the then newly elected governor, Jeff Landry, Meta said they would pull consideration of Louisiana as a project site unless they could get that sales tax exemption for their servers and facility equipment. In response, the governor, the legislator, leaders, and state officials met to form a plan. Shortly after that meeting, during a non-fiscal legislative session, proponents of the data center hijacked the bill to create a special sales tax exemption from Meta. From there, they sweetened the pot and they began negotiating additional property tax exemptions and expedited utility approval to push the project through. This is the first time a utility has asked to build 3 power plants at one time to serve one single customer. And they have expanded its service demand by 30%, again, for just this one customer. Our fear is that this will not be the last. We've already seen an increase in visibility and in speculation on who will be the next company to come to Louisiana. Next slide, please. And click it twice. Awesome. Now, from this facility, they say we can expect 500 permanent jobs, 1,500 megawatts of renewable energy, and a pinky promise to contribute a capped amount towards making a fourth power station in the southern part of the state carbon capture ready, in addition to the 3 new plants being carbon capture ready. If you'll click again. Now, we know the national trend, again, is when there's one, expect some more. So this opens the door for the proliferation of hyperscalers across our state that already has lax regulation. While the governor touted hundreds of jobs, the reality is that most of them will be temporary construction work. Data centers literally don't need many employees to run. Where's the plan that ensures locals get trained and hired for these roles? It doesn't exist. Entergy also didn't open the project up to competition and didn't consider alternatives like wind, solar, and storage. So we don't know if this is the most affordable way to power said data center. Ratepayers will be paying for these plants long after Meta's moved on. Data centers like Meta's are not traditional steady energy users. Their loads change rapidly, sometimes spiking or dropping in ways that current utility planning tools just aren't equipped to predict. The truly atrocious way in which the state has created a way for taxpayers to subsidize this data center for a multi-trillion-dollar mega corporation is worth talking about. Legislation that was meant, again, to expand broadband in rural areas was Columbus and rewritten to give this sales tax rebate. Entergy's proposal cites future possibilities of solar and carbon capture technologies. But again, those aren't a part of this plan. Carbon capture is a dangerous, expensive, and unproven technology that has never been proven to work at scale. What's being considered right now are fossil fuel plants and tons of new emissions. And lastly, we know that hyperscalers around the country use at least 2 million gallons of water per day. How will other water users and ratepayers in and around Richland Parish be impacted by such extreme water demands? How will the ecology of the site be affected by construction, operation, and full life cycle of water usage at the site? Next slide, please. Um, so this is a very real screen grab of what we experienced as interveners at the Public Service Commission. You see literal redactions, like someone took a Sharpie and just marked through all the testimony. During this proceeding, Entergy literally created an entirely new designation for materials called attorney's eyes only that limited access to further information from interveners like us. It was in addition to the already existing, highly sensitive protected material designation that requires parties to sign NDAs to access. So in February, the Alliance for Affordable Energy and the Union of Concerned Scientists filed a motion to defend Louisiana ratepayers against Entergy's attempt to circumvent commission policy. We simply asked the PSC to deny the request to skip the RFP process. They denied it. Then in March, we went back and filed a new motion with UCS to bring transparency to Meta's fossil fuel powered data center plans in Louisiana. We said, look, we could at least require Meta or Laidley or whichever subsidiary they choose to be a part of, make them a party in this docket so that they could share critical information with stakeholders like us, such as anticipated energy demands from the data center, justification for the expedited timeline, and how many local jobs will it create. Formally including Meta and Laidley in that application would have also strengthened legal avenues for holding those companies accountable to ratepayers. If Meta and Lately were not parties in the application, our motion demanded that it be dismissed. That motion was also denied. And so then finally, we followed up with expert testimony that painted a much different picture than the rose-colored glass we were being sold by Meta and Entergy. It told of voltage impacts to neighboring homes and businesses that could cause permanent electrical damage to residents across Louisiana, and us footing the bill and holding all of the risk on the back end of the contract. We believed Entergy's application failed to adequately assess critical grid reliability measures. And by the time the hearing even began, Entergy had already reached a settlement wherein we got peanuts. Not us, because we didn't settle. Despite knowing that settlement had been reached, the parties proceeded into a hearing that did not discuss the settlement details at all. Attorneys with the Louisiana Energy Users Group and the Alliance for Affordable Energy with the Union of Concerned Scientists, the last two remaining opponents to the application, we led questioning of Entergy staff and expert witnesses during that hearing. So the settling parties received this. They got limited customer protections and a commitment from Entergy to self-report a non-binding commitment for an additional 500 megawatts of renewables, a renewable procurement commitment and procedural improvements, and a tiny bit of reporting requirements related to reliability. Next slide, please. To be clear, here is the only publicly accessible snapshot of how many jobs they say this will create. This was found in the pilot documentation for the site, wherein you kind of see the percentages that they will allow them to meet by certain years in order to meet that requirement. So they're not even require those 500, they're not requiring those 500 jobs up front. At some point, by the finish of this bill, there needs to be 500 employees. Next slide, please. Another one of those impacts we mentioned was fuel costs. Now, federal data suggests that ratepayers in Southeast Louisiana, the Southeast regional grid, which includes most of Louisiana, paid over $4.5 billion more in 2022 than in 21 due to higher prices. And we're experiencing firsthand here in Louisiana, especially here in New Orleans, the compounding effects of the volatility of the gas market and the proliferation of LNG on our coastline. And with the federal government being shut down and LIHEAP funding being frozen, we anticipate the 20% utility disconnection rate to soar in the wake of these new deals. Next slide, please. So Meta did kind of admit, maybe there could be some outages, but we've put protections in place. So everyone rest assured they have some protections in place that we still don't know about. Next slide, please. Now, I thought it was really important to include this slide because we just recently experienced a major blackout, something again unprecedented and unfamiliar to us. So as you can see here, we call this the wall, where Louisiana, the Louisiana hub, paid as much as $1,500 per megawatt hour for electricity when two of our nuclear facilities went down. There was a lack of generation in the New Orleans load pocket and a down power line that ran from Southwest Louisiana to Southeast. What you see here is a very real impact of what it looks like when there is an outage, either because of lack of generation or because of a spike in use. Next slide, please. And so recently, the Department of Natural Resources here in Louisiana released their all call for public comment. We have an upcoming hearing on November 18th, and in this permit, we see that they are requesting an air permit for 1,500 megawatts of generation. So that will be 2 of the 3 power plants on site. It would feature the 2 combined cycle turbines, steam turbines, standby generators, diesel pumps, and all the associated infrastructure. The reported emissions from this site will be tons of greenhouse gases. It would literally put the campus as the 2nd worst emitter in the state, behind a coal and a pet coke plant. Next slide, please. Now we're going to pretend we don't see that typo, but Meta recently made a request to withdraw over 5.6 million gallons of water per day, enough to supply over 50,000 people, impacting local water sources and water infrastructure, highlighting the industry's ongoing lack of transparency. We know from looking through meeting notes that even in the very beginnings of this project, Meta refused to do things that a good neighbor would do, like pay to locate the water lines that are on the property you just acquired. Next slide, please. Another major issue is that part of this agreement is that Meta will pay a minimum bill for 15 years that is meant to cover the capital costs of these plants and some of the transmission upgrades. But we know that facilities like this last much longer, and they'll be amortized over 30 years, leaving everyone else at risk for paying for all this stuff when Meta picks up and leaves. It's no longer an if. Just this past week, they announced that along with Blue Owl, a side arm of Meta, they would be acquiring 80% stake in this project, while Meta will only have 20%, and they're only committing to 4 years, which is down from their original commitment of 15 years. For LUG, which is the Louisiana Energy Users Group, one of their biggest issues in this agreement included that 1,500 megawatts of renewable energy puts Meta at the front of the line to get clean energy that industrials have been asking for years. But now they get to skip the line. The industrials also want some of this renewable energy because it helps them lower their bills. Next slide, please. Yep, sorry, lots of clicks. So what we know is I'm sorry, you can go back. I did want to touch on that. The $178 million in profit annually. So for every $1 billion that Meta or Entergy invest in this infrastructure, they get to recoup over $50 million in profits. And so at last count, this is before the updated numbers, we had tallied over $178 million in profits annually to Entergy shareholders. Next slide. Entergy wants to add CCS to Lake Charles Power Plant for Meta. This is the fourth plant I was speaking of. They said they'll pay a significant portion towards the CCS upgrades, but the number of this significant amount is not public. They're also building the two new plants to be CCS ready and the third plant in Cancer Alley to also be CCS ready. But as we know, and our commission has agreed, that CCS is not proven at scale for power plants. Next slide. So what's the cost of our AI use here in Louisiana? Well, for us, we have to pay for fuel and operations costs for 3 new gas plants, two $550 million transmission lines, the cost of those 3 plants after the 15-year contract expires, any adjustments in price demand deemed necessary by Entergy, increased costs related to the energy market and the dependence on the volatility of gas costs. The future implications of AI are not on pace with the very real direct impacts to people's wallets, health, and well-being here in Louisiana. Next slide, please. And this is how I'll wrap up, because I think it's really important to highlight what a win could look like in these types of proceedings. Some of the things we've asked for are that the data center pays for 100% of the interconnection costs. We've asked for no subsidies from ratepayers for generation supply, clear criteria for load shifting and reliability impacts, security deposits for failure to perform. We asked them to consider a microgrid approach to support the energy needs and for transparency on contract provisions that reflect rates, discounts, reliability commitments, and costs to ratepayers. That's all I got. Thanks, y'all.
Well, thank you very much. I guess I'm going to go ahead and start with my presentation next. I am the Director of Land Use at a group called Piedmont Environmental Council. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so you can see my slides. We're a regional nonprofit environmental organization that covers a 9-county region in Virginia. And the unique aspect about our region is that we have the largest data center market in the world. And just for perspective here, here's the Virginia market at 6 gigawatts compared to all the other sites currently operating in the world. And as you can see, this also includes the Asian Pacific and European markets, which the American market absolutely dwarfs. So this is a nationwide explosion. In Virginia, not only do we already have the largest data center market operating, which is those pink dots that we've been mapping over time, we also have the largest planned growth coming down the line as far as we can tell, just comparing it to some of the other maps that are online. We have over 100 data center projects in the state that are moving forward all over. Most of them are clustered in Northern Virginia and along the I-95 corridor. But this is a huge amount of growth coming down the line. Currently, there's about 60 million square feet constructed or is constructed or under construction. And then we've got about 350 million square feet approved or in the pipeline. And just for comparison's sake, what is 350 million square feet? That's about the equivalent of 2,000 Walmart supercenters. So that's what we've got coming down the line. And what does that translate into? Well, those data center customers actually hold contracts with Dominion Energy and the co-ops under its transmission service area for 47 gigawatts of power. But their forecast going forward for the next 20 years, this is kind of including a ramp up period for those contracts and kind of saying that all wouldn't happen right away, and many of those might not play out. So the forecast that's been put forward into the regional transmission operators plan for 2025 is 28 gigawatts of load growth. So that gray line at the bottom is our current peak. It's showing where the peak has been since 1995 to 2024. So we're talking about more than doubling our load. And just for perspective, what is 28 gigawatts? Well, I mean, you can think about it. 1 gigawatt is basically about a gas plant or it's a nuclear reactor. So trying to bring online an additional 28 gigawatts. And it also keep in mind that it took us 100 years to build out a system that handled 23 gigawatts. So to commit to building additional 28 gigawatts within the next, 15 to 20 years, that is a huge amount of growth. And then the question is who pays and who bears the risk of that growth. We've talked a little bit about that, but we'll just kind of highlight what we've been trying to emphasize in the rate making cases in front of the largest utility accommodating this load growth from data centers in Virginia, which is Dominion Energy. Um, there's many different facets. One of them is that they're the largest customer. Over a third of the entire energy customer base in Dominion Energy is now data centers. And so that gives them a lot of leverage to negotiate and to be engaged in all of these different rate making cases and have lawyers for every data center company, along with the data center coalition and other interested entities associated with the industry. So that gives them a lot of leverage in these discussions. And then, of course, they have their own private contracts for certain deals. But then there's also just this flawed rate structure that we've used. And prior to data center load growth, which is a new paradigm of 24/7 large load, customers driving the increase on the grid, it was driven by peak usage. And so that would be like the folks who come home at night, we all turn on our power, and there's this peak that happens at like 6 p.m. Because of the usage of our electric devices and everything else when we're coming home from work and things like that. And then the peak usage on key days in the year, which would be the hottest days of the summer or the coldest days in the winter. And that used to be what we were really kind of building the rate structure off of. And a lot of the cost for new transmission lines and energy infrastructure fell onto the peak load drivers. But really, what's driving the increase in new generation that needs to come online, that 28 gigawatts we were just talking about, or 47 if you're looking at the contracts, that is being driven by solely data center growth. In fact, residential is flat to declining because of efficiency gains in homes and solar on rooftop and things like that. So we need to shift that cost if we're going to build all these new transmission lines and new generation that needs to actually be falling onto the industry demanding that additional cost. The other problem is that the high demand is causing higher capacity costs because you have an imbalance between supply and demand. And so we know the gas prices are going up, but also just the capacity costs within our energy market, the auction that we have each year for energy prices here in the PJM regional transmission area were the highest they've ever been for the last 2 years. And then you have the transmission lines that are solely serving data centers that are being subsidized by all customers. So because of the sheer amount of power that they're demanding, they need their own transmission line. Well, instead of being treated like distribution lines, which there's an end of the line policy where that would be paid for by that customer, or a large chunk of it would be paid for by that customer to extend the line. Instead, everybody's sharing the cost of that because it's a transmission line, and transmission lines are considered part of the larger infrastructure that serves everyone, even though that transmission line is only serving a data center. And we have hundreds of those coming through the pipeline to serve all these data centers. Then you have the huge risk that's borne by the rest of the ratepayers. And we talked a little bit about that, but if the growth doesn't build out as fast as expected, then that cost of all that infrastructure that we've built out falls on to everybody else. And so that's a huge risk being borne by the rest of the customers. And we need to make sure that we're mitigating that risk. And that's all the aspects that we've been trying to push in these rate making cases. And we encourage other states to do the same in their states. And I know Ohio, Georgia are all having similar conversations. But why is data center growth in particular having such a huge impact on communities? I want to delve into that a little bit. This is really completely unprecedented. This is not like, fast food restaurants or new shopping malls. Like this is a different impact in terms of land use. And so, first of all, I would say it's an explosive growth trend, and there's a lot of speculation around it. So that's part of the problem. You've got land developers. Land here in Virginia is going for $4 million an acre. And so that is encouraging a huge amount of speculation. They also use more energy than most other uses. Maybe a steel mill will use as much, but very few other land uses use as much power as a city, like a data center building does. Then you have more generators on site than any other use. A hospital, a university might have a couple backup generators. No other use that I've seen has 100+ generators on site, which is what this industry has. And then it's a consumptive water use, which there is like bottling plants and things like that that would be a consumptive water use, but most uses are more like a hotel where the water goes down the drain, it goes into the wastewater treatment facility, and then it is cleaned up and released back into a water body. But the water use of a data center is evaporated out, and so it's lost to evaporation, which can have a significant impact on water supply. And then the other thing that we talked about a little bit earlier is that they tend to cluster. Once you get one data center and the energy infrastructure is put in place and the fiber lines are in place, you tend to get more of them, which leads to cumulative impacts on air quality, water consumption, and energy infrastructure. So what we've been seeing, just to summarize here, is higher electric bills, public and private right-of-way being taken for transmission lines, land conversion, and habitat loss for both the data centers and the energy infrastructure, renewable energy transition that's been forfeited and climate action put on hold, industrialization of communities and pushing out all other land uses. When land's going for $4 million an acre, nobody wants to build anything else, including housing or any other type of flex industrial. And then air quality degradation, on-site power, but also the power plants is leading to air quality pollution, and then water supply and water quality impacts from cooling and the effluent that comes down the line. So this is just showing you some of the transmission lines that we're seeing being built out to serve that cluster of all those data center proposals. And I just wanted to highlight, not only does this cost $12 billion to build out all this transmission infrastructure, but it also, has huge impacts on the communities that these lines are going through, and they're going well beyond the footprint of the data center. They're going all the way out into West Virginia to pick up energy from coal facilities and all the way down to Lynchburg to get that power up to where the data centers actually are. And what does that look like? So this is Loudoun County, Virginia. You're looking at the Washington and Old Dominion Recreational Trail, a major biking corridor in our region. And just to kind of show you what it started to look like is we have substations and transmission lines. And where do they put transmission lines when they can't plow them through? Because there's houses, they can't put them through communities. They find trails, they find riparian corridors, which is the buffers around streams. They find parks, basically any land they can go through without taking people's homes if they can help it. Although we have one transmission line that is threatening to take a person's house. And so that is really becoming a major impact in our community. This is another example of just what it looks like to have these things right up next to your house. This is only a 230 kV though, and there are plans for a 500 kV that is going to go right up next to people's houses. And this is the one that would potentially require someone to actually lose their home to get this extension cord for the data center industry put in place. And then there's the hidden danger of all those generators. As I said, there's so many of these on site that the cumulative impacts of all those minor permits that didn't have any public review is really becoming very pronounced. So we have 2,000 just in that area. That picture I was showing you of the Washington and Old Dominion Trail, that's the green line going through this map. And so we have 2,000 within just, I think it's 2 mile corridor here that have the potential in an outage event to all just kick on. Or they are increasingly being used for other things like or there's proposals for them to be used for things like demand response or planned outage events. So this is a study that was done by the University of California, just showing what the public health impact is of those generators operating in that Northern Virginia I-95 corridor. And this is only at the 10% of their permitted capacity because they're only run for maintenance purposes and outage events. And so they're not all the way up at the top of they're not using all the emissions that they're allowed to use in their permits. And so what we're seeing now is a push to allow them to run for a planned outage while they're building new transmission lines. Basically, they cut off the lines and these data centers would go offline. And then also for demand response, and then maximize those permits that they've received, which the cumulative impacts, you multiply what you see on the screen by 10. It's a significant public health cost. And then water consumption we talked about a little bit, but it's not just to cool the data center, it's also the indirect water usage for those new gas plants and potentially nuclear facilities. And again, that water usage is consumptive, not just for the data center, but also for the cooling of the gas plants as well. Very often that's consumptive as well. The water usage that we've seen in Loudoun County alone has really increased significantly. So now it's about 10% of our total system capacity. The potable water usage has surpassed the reclaimed water usage on our system. And we see the highest usage, of course, in August, which is also when the river levels are the lowest and when the risk of, drought concerns are the highest. And then finally, wastewater impacts is something that's not very much talked about, but it's something that at least communities should be asking about when these facilities are coming in so that the wastewater treatment facility is prepared because it can lead to because so much water is being evaporated out, the blowdown that comes down, which is like just flushed back out through the system, can lead to higher salinity levels. It can contain things like corrosion inhibitors, biocides, and heavy metals. So they need to be prepared. And especially when you're talking about these large facilities in very rural areas with very small wastewater treatment facilities, that could be a huge impact. And then finally, these are the questions I would just encourage folks to ask. You need to know the size of the facility, you need to know the energy usage, you need to know the energy infrastructure that's going to be required to serve the site, you need to know water usage, you need to know what effluent is to be expected. Is it air cooled? Is it water cooled? What's going to be in that effluent. And then emissions on site and commitments to reduce climate impact from the grid. My key advice to you, just having gone through a bunch of these data center projects here in Virginia, demand details, demand transparency, NDAs. Ask who's signed NDAs. NDAs are non-disclosure agreements. Ask who signed them and make sure that the planning staff are not withholding information because they feel they need to from NDAs, because Freedom of Information Act should trump. It depends on exactly what we're talking about, but generally your planning staff should have to provide you full information about the application, and they shouldn't be able to hold that back because of non-disclosure agreements. And then finally, make sure that if you don't already have data centers, that you have a discretionary decision process in place. In other words, what I'm saying is don't allow data centers by right. Don't have zoning that says a data center can be done without any kind of public hearing or discretionary decision from your elected officials, because you have to hold them accountable. And this technology is changing so fast that what was a data center 5 years ago is a totally different animal of what a data center is now. And so we really need to have a discretionary decision process. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Shorraw. I'm the Policy and Program Coordinator for Physicians for Social Responsibility of Pennsylvania. Thank you for being here, and welcome to my segment, Data Center Impacts in Pennsylvania and the Role of Local Ordinances. Next slide, please. PSRPA was originally founded to oppose nuclear weapons and in the 90s shifted to apply its medical expertise to environmental health issues in recognition that global climate change and toxic pollution pose grave risks to human health. The goal is to address health harms for which you cannot write a prescription. PSRPA promotes socially and environmentally responsible practices, policies, and programs to safeguard and improve public health. And we accomplish this through education, training, direct service, and advocacy. Next slide, please. As Ava mentioned or explained earlier, when we talk about data centers, we're referring to the massive facilities and campuses that host the servers, storage, networking, and support systems underpinning cloud computing, AI, streaming, e-commerce, and more. Because these facilities must run 24/7, they demand continuous power and almost constant cooling to dissipate the heat generated by dense server racks. So to give you a sense of scale, in the US, the most recent report estimates data center electricity use at about 4.4% of all US electricity in 2023. That share could rise to 6.7 to 12% by 2028, according to the US Department of Energy. Globally, data centers consumed about 460 terawatt hours in 2022, roughly 1.4 to 1.7% of global electricity use. These centers are no longer a niche tech facility. They're now part of overall tech infrastructure. They power the backbone of business, public services, research, and daily life. That means their energy footprint, their siting, cooling, grid connection, all matter deeply for communities and policy. How and where they function also matters deeply to communities in terms of health impacts, equity, labor, and land use rights. Next slide, please. So here in Pennsylvania, we find ourselves at a strategic inflection point. On the one hand, the data center industry is growing rapidly across the country. AI, cloud ramp up, digital services all require more capacity. But on the other hand, Pennsylvania has many of the physical and economic features that attract data centers. Available land near transmission lines, many former industrial sites, such as brownfields from coal plants and from steel facilities and other stranded assets, and incentives for development. The key point, because we're still early in this wave, we have the opportunity to plan smarter. Rather than reacting after problems arise, with grid stress, community pushback, environmental impacts, we can set frameworks today that balance innovation with protection. If we wait until the large clusters are fully built and operating, local governments and communities will lose leverage. So this is a moment for local governments to act proactively. Next slide. The introduction of large-scale data centers brings the potential benefits: new investment, high-tech job opportunities, repurposing of industrial land, strengthening regional infrastructure. But the flip side, without careful integration, these facilities can pose major risks to community well-being through noise, light, traffic, emissions, water use, local grid impacts. All of these will negatively affect community members when these sites are too close to residential properties or not zoned properly in communities. This is a fundamental balancing act. How do we enable innovation and economic development from the data center economy while simultaneously safeguarding the health, environment, livability, and future of our communities? That balanced lens should guide how we approach policy, siting, regulation, and community engagement. Next slide. When evaluating the sustainability of a data center, the question isn't simply how many megawatts or how efficient the servers or cooling are, although those matter. A more fundamental question is, what is the source of the electricity used by that facility? If the data center draws its power from a heavily fossil-based grid or relies on backup diesel gas generators, sometimes called emergency generators, then its environmental footprint may be significant, even if the facility itself is technically efficient. Some data centers claim to be green by purchasing renewable energy credits, but those credits do not always ensure additional renewable generation or truly reduced fossil use, especially if they're using fossil fuel to power them. The energy source behind the load is the defining variable for real sustainability. When local governments and communities evaluate siting and policy, they must ask, are we locking in higher fossil demand, or are we enabling clean energy powered operation? Next slide. Next slide, please. As a health-focused organization, this is where the rubber meets the road. The environmental impacts of energy production and industrial infrastructure translate directly into human health consequences. When data centers drive increased electricity demand, especially if powered by fossil fuels, including backup generators, we see more emissions of fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, ozone-forming precursors, ground level pollution, and associated exposures that negatively impact public health. In general, these exposures are linked in peer-reviewed literature to higher rates of asthma, heart disease, respiratory illnesses, and premature death. It is not sufficient to treat data centers as technology or economic infrastructure alone. Their siting and operation are public health concerns. So when local governments evaluate data centers, they must include a health impact lens, not just zoning or power line cost analysis. I would also be remiss not to mention the risk of driving up energy costs for everyday consumers. As more data centers come online without matching infrastructure investment, the grid faces increasing strain. Without proper safeguards and regulations, utilities may pass these costs on to ratepayers, meaning residents could end up paying higher bills for energy they never used. Next slide. To bring this all into practical terms, let's consider a Pennsylvania community example, Salem Township in Luzerne County. In this case, we see a large complex with dozens of emergency generators fueled by gas or diesel. The PA Department of Environmental Protection is currently accepting comments on an application for the facility to use 72 diesel-fired generators permitted under emergency use status, 4 750 kilowatt generators and 1 250 kilowatt generator, cumulatively representing substantial emissions and local impact. This helps to make the abstract concrete. This is more than a spreadsheet or power load forecast. It's about real machines, real noise, real emissions in real neighborhoods. It underscores a key gap. State-level air permits or power connection approvals may not fully address local well-being, noise, aesthetics, or community input. That's why local ordinances and proactive governance matter. Next slide. One of the major strengths of Pennsylvania is that local governments are empowered. The municipalities planning code, the MPC, and the home rule charter law and related statutes enable boroughs, townships, and cities in Pennsylvania to adopt comprehensive plans, zoning ordinances, land development regulations, and to enforce those regulations within their boundaries because local elected officials are sworn to protect the public health of their constituents. In practical terms, that means local officials and residents are not passive spectators. They can set conditions on how large infrastructure, such as data centers, come into their locality. That means communities in Pennsylvania do not necessarily have to accept large developments without input or safeguards. So the message here is, yes, the state framework matters, but local governments can and should act decisively to protect community interests. Next slide. Local ordinances are where policy meets practice. Through zoning and environmental nuisance statutes, local governments can require that data centers comply with noise limits at property lines, limit backup generator testing times, require screened lighting and dark sky compliant design, monitor water cooling discharges, impose buffer zones and landscaping, and hold public hearings. They give practical control, not just theoretical, over how infrastructure impacts bear on neighboring properties and communities. When properly crafted, Local rules ensure that community well-being is a part of the equation, not an afterthought. And this doesn't just govern data centers either. Some of these ordinances shouldn't target one industry. An ordinance such as an environmental nuisance ordinance would be enforced across the board to protect residents from any listed nuisance from any source, and would require those nuisances to be abated for the good of the general welfare, much like a code officer would ensure that someone's lawn was properly maintained or that a house was properly taken care of. Next slide. A key advantage of local ordinances is that they allow for prevention, not just reaction. If the rules are written in advance, so a backup generator testing only during business hours, or lighting must be fully shielded and downward directed, or noise cannot exceed X decibels at the property line. If those are written in advance, then developers know the conditions up front, communities are aware of the expectations, and potential impacts are managed from the start. Contrast that with reactive models, where neighbors raise complaints after operations start, mitigation is costly, and relationships are already strained. A preventative ordinance helps build trust, reduce litigation or delays, and aligns development with community expectations before issues escalate. These ordinances could also develop a community benefits agreement that is mutually agreeable with all parties so that all of these processes are in place and properly functioning before the development is even up and running. Next slide. Behind the technical details lies a broader theme: empowerment and transparency. When local governments enact ordinances, hold public hearings, require clear disclosures about power sources, cooling systems, noise levels, etc., then residents are informed and have meaningful input. They don't feel that their local officials are hiding anything from them if there is a clear discourse and open, transparent process behind all of this. It's not just about regulation, it's about agency. Communities should have a say in how their neighborhoods evolve, what kinds of infrastructure are appropriate, how risks are managed, and how benefits are distributed. Transparent processes reduce conflict, increase legitimacy, and lead to better outcomes overall. Next slide. As we look ahead, one of the strongest strategies is to get ahead of the curve, to build partnerships and frameworks before the surge of large data center loads becomes entrenched. That means local governments are the forefront of this fight. They must work with utilities, developers, community groups, land use planners, environmental health, and labor advocates to map out how the grid can accommodate growth, how land use decisions should be made, how water use and cooling discharge will be managed, how health impacts are mitigated, and how noise, light, and vibration impacts will be mitigated as well. In Pennsylvania, some of these tools already exist. For example, multi-municipal planning under the MPC. The goal is to avoid being forced into ad hoc decisions or reactive battles, and instead engage in strategic joint planning amongst municipalities that align development with community values and environmental health. Next slide. In closing, let me leave you with a message of optimism and empowerment. The reality is the decisions we make now at this inflection point will shape the future of data center development, our energy system, and community health across Pennsylvania and across the nation. And the great news is local leadership matters. Municipalities, townships, boroughs, cities across the Commonwealth and across the nation have the authority, the tools, and the motivation to steer growth so that it benefits residents, preserves environmental and health quality, and positions us wisely in the digital economy. By embracing partnership, vision, and strong local governance, we can ensure that this wave of infrastructure is not something done to communities, but done with them and for them. And before I go, I'd like to leave you with Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution, which is not often cited and should be cited more. It says, "The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for those amazing presentations. I know we're right at 3 o'clock, but if you all are willing to stay on for a couple of more minutes, we can answer some questions. If folks want to turn back on their video, we can answer some questions. So one question that we got in was, if local leaders have already approved multiple data centers, what can communities do to slow or stop the build? And I just add to that, or add protections to protect them from the stuff that you folks mentioned.
Well, I'll go ahead and chime in on that because I think Virginia is in that, especially Northern Virginia where I live, is in that place right now. We've already approved a whole lot of data centers. So what I would say is getting involved in the rate making cases with your PUC, or here in Virginia, it's our state corporation commission, so that the cost of all that infrastructure is borne by the industry itself, and not by the rest of the ratepayer. So that's one thing. And honestly, I think that also helps to slow down the process a little bit as well. And you might see some of the projects start to fall out because there's been so much speculation around these projects, and they didn't have to put very much money on the line, that when they start to actually have to pay for all these transmission lines and a good portion of the generation costs themselves, they might have to rethink the financials of the project. Same thing with your the rest of kind of the what we call performance standards in your community. Operating data centers can still be subject to performance standards. So, for example, if there's a lot of noise coming from data centers, you can work with your elected officials or the planning staff to get noise ordinance changes put in place, and those could potentially retroactively affect those operating data centers. It's a little bit tricky because, of course, they can sue the county, and there's grandfather, and there's all sorts of ways that it might not work. But if the sound is significant enough, localities will try to do something about it. And the same thing with lighting. There's a lot of different things that you can try to do in those performance standards. Beyond that, it's also just working with the industry. A lot of these companies do have a reputation to uphold, and so, just kind of embarrassing them for the impacts that they're causing to the community, and then hopefully they decide to change them on their own. That's what I would say.
And if I may add too, I think educating other community members about the impacts, about, if someone in particular is experiencing noise issues or light issues or whatever the case may be, educating your fellow community members, your neighbors, about what's going on, holding public meetings, demanding that your local councils have hearings and meetings about the situation. And if they refuse, have your own public meeting at a library or something, just to keep educating. And demand for those ordinance changes as well. Even if they get challenged, it's still worth pushing forward, because maybe they won't be able to retroactively impact whatever's happening, but maybe going forward, you'll set new standards, which is still a positive.
Yeah, one last thing I'll add in there is a lot of these data centers have a ramp up period. And so it takes them 3 to 5 years to build out their full campus or whatever. And so you might have some opportunity in there with those performance standards where maybe the first building is grandfathered, but the rest, maybe the new ordinance, whatever you got adopted, applies.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you guys for that. Yeah, I'll just leave with one last question. Someone asked, are there any acceptable data centers, and what might the elements of an acceptable data center be? I know you guys sort of answered that throughout your presentations. And then that connects with another question, which is, do companies want to utilize solar, battery storage, and wind to power data centers? And asks, wouldn't those options be more economical and cleaner versus the energy that they're trying to build now?
I'll go ahead and jump in. I would say that the industry absolutely is not opposed to renewable energy. At least that's what I've seen from my experience. The problem is they want power and they want it yesterday, and they want all the above, whatever can get on the grid. And they want fully dispatchable power that's available 24/7. And the problem is that battery storage, just at least the utilities feel like it's not there yet. And so the utilities are putting forward these gas projects and these other types of projects to meet that need. And basically, the data center industry is saying, whatever you need to do, we support, just get us power. They're where it's coming from agnostic. um, yeah. I don't know if that helps. I do think I should highlight though, there is pilot projects by some data centers like energy storage on site that's being used, like battery storage, long duration battery storage that's being used in like pilot projects for demand response. Like Iron Mountain, for example, here in Manassas has a project like that. I think it's really great to see that. The problem I'm hearing from the industry, because I have given a couple presentations to the industry itself, and what I always hear back is, well, I have a customer to serve. I am building the data center to meet the specs that the customer has required. And this customer might be Microsoft, it might be QTS, it doesn't matter. The point is that they're just trying to meet those specs. So until those specs change from those customers that are demanding this, they are unable to sell a more sustainable product. And so what they're kind of saying to me is, hey, if you want to get the regulatory changes in place that will make it easier for me to sell my more sustainable product to these large companies, that would be great. And so this is where regulation comes into play. We have to raise the bar for everyone. We can't just ask one data center company to go out on a limb and lose their price advantage or their speed to market advantage, and make these changes, because this is a race. We got to raise the bar for everyone to get really positive change.
And I'll just echo too. I know here in Pennsylvania, gas production is huge, fracking is huge. All of this infrastructure already exists, and since they want it so quickly and immediately, they figure, well, let's just use what we have, and we'll figure out more sustainable things later. If later ever comes, that's debatable. We hope it does. But also, to put it into perspective, Pennsylvania's renewable energy portfolio is only 4%. So it's so minuscule compared to gas or even nuclear or other sources. So we really have here a long way to go before we can meet that demand, even if there's appetite for it from the developers. We still have such a long way to go to develop more renewable sources. And that takes policy, and that takes willingness from leaders, and also just for it to be more financially feasible for all parties, for them to have an appetite to do it.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, I think in the interest of time, we will end there. But just a reminder to folks, the recording and slides will be made available. And yeah, thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.